So my most recent book has the subtitle How the British Establishment Made the Far Right Respectable. Their sort of moral and political yardstick is, have we sufficiently bashed the left today? And do the right-wing papers applaud us for doing it?
If I asked you this question in 2012, you probably would have laughed at me. And I think most people would have thought this was really insane.
Something that was a very marginal form of politics when I began my career as a reporter has gone mainstream.
It's inevitable in this conversation. We can mention people like Donald Trump, Nigel Farage, Rupert Lowe, Tommy Robertson, Narendra Modi. None of these people call themselves, part of the far right or extreme radical right or anything of that sort.
It's very common for far right populists to present themselves as more democratic than their opponents.
Do you think Nigel Farage will be the next prime minister? And
come the next election, his party will win a lot of seats.
Outside of, the fact that Keir Starmer is Keir Starmer, but that's obviously part of the answer.
Far-right populists are also committed capitalists. They love markets, they love profit, they love inequality.
Okay. Is the AC too cold for you?
No, it's good.
Okay, great. I mean, you just came from outside. You may feel differently in half an hour, but anyway.
Yeah.
That's fine. Okay. 1, 2, 3. Hi, good day. Welcome to another episode of Unapologetic. I'm your host, Ishfaq Kareem, and I'm really pleased to welcome in studio today Daniel Trilling. Daniel, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for inviting me.
Daniel is a journalist. He's been covering many things, but specifically he's been one of the most prominent journalists in the UK, writing about and covering what's called the far right or far right politics or conservative politics. You may frame it a bunch of ways. Daniel, we're having what I think is a very important discussion. You obviously think it's an important discussion because you've been writing about this stuff and doing investigations about this and really covering it exhaustively for the last 20 years. We do live in a moment where when you started this kind of journalism, people probably thought, why are you writing this? But right now, I think most people seeing the show would be like, they may have, concerns or deep fears about what we call the far right. Before we get into the meat of the discussion, I want you to define some of those terms. But before we even do that, just tell me what your reflections are on the fact of the question I just asked. The fact that right now, 20 years later, or 20 years into you writing about this now has become a much bigger sort of issue for all of us.
Yeah, so I mean, it's been 10 years now since what we talk about as right-wing populism or populist strongmen have been a big feature of politics in many liberal democracies around the world. And I think for that time, there's been this ongoing debate about, well, what is this thing? How new is it? How much is it a resurgence of fascism from the 20th century and so on? And I suppose my approach to it is that 20 years ago as a journalist, when I was just starting out, I was very interested in the groups on the very fringes of politics that were actually trying to revive the fascist tradition from the 20th century. And I think coming in at it from that direction has enabled me to see how something that was a very marginal form of politics when I began my career as a reporter has gone mainstream, but also the version of it that's gone mainstream is quite different from what it was 20 years ago or past instances in history where we've seen similar kinds of politics. And I think what I try to get across to readers these days is that, yes, this does have echoes of the past. And we've certainly, in the UK, for instance, but also a lot of other countries, have seen ideas, rhetoric, claims about the people around us that were once regarded as extreme and marginal go completely mainstream. But that this has a life of its own. It's not a repeat of history. This is something that you have to understand as a phenomenon of the times that we live in. It is dangerous, but it's also very unpredictable.
No, I mean, it's inevitable in this conversation. We can mention people like Donald Trump, Nigel Farage, Rupert Lowe, Tommy Robertson, Narendra Modi, Erdogan. There's so many politicians that sort of come up, right? Different parts of the world, different continents. All of them, we'll probably refer to them at some point as people who are populist, as you mentioned. That means different things for different people. None of these people call themselves, part of the far right or extreme radical right or anything of that sort. We may refer to some of them in that way. Explain to the audience just what are these terms and why these people obviously don't see them as them. They normally call themselves Democrats or leaders or brave and bold, courageous people restoring national identity or patriotism or something, noble and wonderful, if you take the noble and wonderful definitions of those terms. But just kind of explain to us what these terms are.
Yeah, so my most recent book has the subtitle How the British Establishment Made the Far Right Respectable. And I'm using that term far right there, very deliberately, but also precisely, because the way that I find most useful to characterize these changes in politics that we've seen both in Britain and internationally in recent years is that there's a collection of groups and movements that sit outside what we traditionally regard as mainstream centre-right politics, that all trade in forms of radical right-wing nationalism. They're all seeking in one way or another to redraw the boundaries, sometimes literally the borders, but also crucially the kind of cultural boundaries of their countries and of what national identity is seen as more narrowly. But they're also really antagonistic to democratic systems as we know them. And I think for that reason, it's important to talk of these different movements as part of the same overall trend, even though there are some quite marked differences between them within that. So the most useful definition of the term far right that I've found, because obviously that's a term people argue over all the time, it's the kind of term that nobody would ever voluntarily apply to their own politics. Nobody on the far right, I think, would describe their own politics as far right. But it is useful. And the most useful definition of that I found comes from a political scientist called Cas Mudde, who's a Dutch political scientist, one of the world's leading experts on this subject. And he uses the term far right to cover this broad range of groups and movements that I've described. But within that, he divides them into two wings. So one wing of that is what he calls the extreme right. And those are groups that, as Mudde puts it, reject the essence of democracy. So the fascism of Europe in the early to mid 20th century would sit squarely within that wing of the far right. Fascism aims essentially to replace democracy with dictatorship. But the other wing of it is what Mudde and a lot of other scholars will call the radical right. It's what we often, in more everyday political speech, talk about as right-wing populism. And those groups and parties and leaders accept the essence of democracy, as Mudde puts it, in that they participate in electoral systems. They abide by the results of elections most of the time. Obviously, there are kind of examples where they chafe against that. And they have a strong rhetorical commitment to democracy. It's very common for far-right populists to present themselves as more democratic than their opponents. Think how often they talk about free speech and kind of have this whole narrative that their free speech is being silenced by other less democratic forces in politics and so on. But, as Mudde points out, they are uniformly hostile to certain aspects of liberal democracy. Democracy exists in the abstract, but in order to enact it in a society, you have to have a particular way of doing it. The particular way of doing it that Britain, many other countries around the world have, is liberal democracy. And the essence of that is you have elections, but then you have stable, independent institutions within and outside the state that are supposed to act as checks and balances on the executive, on democracy as a whole, to prevent democracy from becoming effectively a form of elective dictatorship. And far-right populists, to varying degrees, are hostile to some of the key institutions of liberal democracy. So they very often will attack the independent judiciary. Either rhetorically, they'll say that judges are biased and to quote the Daily Mail from about a decade ago in the UK, enemies of the people, or in power, they'll actually seek to curb the independence and operations of the judiciary, as has happened in countries from different parts of the world. Poland is a notable example where that happened. Or the idea of a free, independent media that is able to scrutinize and criticize people in power. Again, far-right populists will often have a very negative set of claims about independent media and journalism and so on. And so for these reasons, although far-right populism presents itself as a kind of reinvigoration of democracy very often, restoring control to the people, which is a very kind of common claim within that form of politics, I argue that actually it's ultimately a threat to our freedom and a threat to well-functioning democracy as we know it.
Okay, I think for the audience, the best way to kind of explain this is through anecdotes, right? So we've seen a lot of what you're speaking about, the encroachment on press, the encroachment on judicial systems. We've seen that in the USA, which, traditionally calls itself the bastion of democracy, which is a very old democracy. Can you go a bit more into that, just sort of to then anecdotally the audience has an example or a case study that they can understand?
Yeah, well, I mean, for me, the best way to sum it up is to go back to that idea of free speech. So free speech is the kind of rallying cry of the contemporary far right, from the radical right part across to the extreme part of the far right. But if you look at pretty much anywhere that a right-wing populist government has taken power, speech has not become more free. Political expression has not become more free. In fact, in almost every case I can think of, it has become less so. So in the US, for instance, you have got Donald Trump repeatedly attacking journalists in the media, threatening to sue large media organizations. He's been threatening to sue the BBC. That's a media organization in another country, on the basis of reporting that he dislikes. In Hungary, under Viktor Orban, the far-right populist prime minister who was in power for, I think, 16 years, he gutted the country's media as an independent set of organizations. He brought in restrictive laws. He installed his cronies at the top of the businesses that were in control of the Hungarian media, and so on. So it's moves like that show what I mean, I think. Likewise with courts and the judiciary. You see again and again the way that far-right populists will try to undermine or stifle or neutralise the judiciary as an independent body. Again, I think there's been efforts in the US to do that, and also to press parts of the criminal justice system into the direct political service of the president. What Trump has done with the FBI, ordering the Department of Justice to go after his critics and political opponents and so on, is typical of far-right populism. I think also Poland, where the far-right populist Law and Justice Party were in government for quite some years, is another good example of that. Under Law and Justice, Poland's Supreme Court was stuffed with friendly judges, one result of which was that they tried to almost entirely outlaw abortion at the beginning of the 2020s, which was a policy very much in keeping with the Law and Justice government's right-wing Catholic nationalist ideology.
Now, you've alluded to your book, If You Tolerate This, right? It's about how the establishment basically enabled the rise of the far right in the UK specifically. We've just come out of the local elections where Reform have got in excess of 1,400 seats, where previously they just were councillors, where previously they just had, just barely over 100, and Labour has lost, more than 1,200. Obviously, the other victors were Greens. The Lib Dems also increased. But this wasn't shocking because of polling. But I think if I asked you this question in 2012, you probably would have laughed at me, and I think most people would have thought this was really insane. Now, that's a premise for a much bigger question, which we'll probably spend the next hour discussing. In your book, you kind of trace for us that there's a bunch of push and pull factors that have allowed this trend to occur in the UK, but elsewhere. And it basically starts, it starts in the 90s, and it starts with a bunch of things. It even precedes that. But I just want to draw on the time that you've been reporting, and we can obviously speak about history, but just specifically. And basically the financial crisis in 2008 sort of spurs this idea, and it's not an idea, it spurs a reality where, in fact, people, the ordinary person, is kind of started to squeeze. And at the same time, globally, around the year 2010, there's lots of these protests. They start in the Arab world, they end up at Occupy Wall Street, they end up in multiple countries. Very few of those protests actually sort of culminated in any socialist changes on the left, right? They actually resulted in often in nothing, or in governments that were more conservative. And then you start with austerity almost in most places again, where this phenomenon has occurred. And then you start seeing electoral gains around 2016, 2017. I mean, with Brexit, Trump, Modi takes power before that, but that's also quite clear. Now, your book also separates between what you call cowards, which is your last chapter, fanatics, which is basically, the people, the proponents of what you call far right ideology, and opportunists, who you in the book kind of, it's the Tories and the Conservatives, and the cowards are the elites and Labour. Run us through how, I mean, don't do it separately because we can't do it all, but kind of take us through the evolution of this stuff. You just start at a point you want to begin at, and maybe, if you want to talk about earlier anecdotes from your reporting, but just take the audience and us now through this journey of how, the far right rising is not this surprise. How you say in your book, it's kind of like a frog that's been boiling slowly in the water. So just take us through that journey.
Yeah, well, I think I'll start with something that you said, which was, if you had in 2012, you had said to me or to anybody else, this stuff is going to be mainstream, they probably wouldn't have believed you. And I agree. I mean, at that time, I was already writing about far-right politics, and my first book was about the first really successful far-right party in the UK, which was the British National Party, known as the BNP for short. And I published a book in 2011 about the BNP and how they had managed to have the success they did. And it actually concludes with me saying, don't think that just because this party has collapsed and seems to have vanished off the map, that it means this far-right stuff has gone. It's actually more dangerous now because it's being used and put forward by people who could take it much further. So I'm not claiming any great kind of act of Nostradamus-like prediction here, because I couldn't have predicted what then happened. But I was already at that point quite convinced that this kind of politics had the potential to go much further and become a much bigger presence on the political landscape internationally. And I think to illustrate that, it's probably most useful if I talk about Britain specifically now, because that's where I've done most of my reporting on this subject, although I do write about international politics and have reported from other countries as well. So the BNP are a party that came from that fascist tradition that I described earlier. They were founded by neo-Nazis, people who had a huge admiration for Hitler in the wake of the Second World War, seeing what his politics had led to, and thought, yes, we like that. We want to recreate that in post-war Britain. The BNP existed for several decades on that basis, and politically speaking, had very little success. It was involved in open racist violence, racist rhetoric, street rallies, and so on. But at the turn of the millennium, a new leader, Nick Griffin, took charge of the BNP and decided to revamp its image and pursue an early version of what we would now call right-wing populism. So the open neo-Nazism was brushed under the carpet. The BNP tried to make itself look like a professional political party. Its leaders and its candidates put on suits. They campaigned for election in local government, and they focused on a set of themes that we now find very familiar. They talked about the elites having let down the ordinary people of the country. They used immigration as the symbol of that betrayal, and used it as an indicator of what had gone wrong in the country more broadly, a bit like with Trump's support coming partly from those Rust Belt areas of the United States. The BNP campaigned very hard and had its greatest successes in deindustrialized towns in the north of England. The BNP didn't get very far with that because they were at heart neo-Nazis, and it was very easy for people to see that. But the fact they even got as far as they did, winning several dozen seats in local government, I argued at the time, showed that there was a much bigger potential reservoir of support for that kind of politics, shed of its associations with the extreme right. And that's what then happened in Britain, as happened in many other countries during the 2010s. So the BNP was superseded by the UK Independence Party, UKIP, led by Nigel Farage. UKIP picked up similar demographics in its support, but also added to that with people from other parts of British society, built that into a campaign for Britain to leave the European Union, which saw success in the 2016 referendum. Farage then kept pursuing those projects under different names, subsequently leading us to where we are now with Reform UK being a far-right populist party, which makes a very, very kind of clear distinction between itself and the extreme right. So Reform really dispute the description of their own politics as far right, because they will say, no, the far right is that extremist stuff over there. That's not what we do. But they are, as I've written about at length previously, a far right populist party in exactly the way that we've been talking about. So that's the trajectory of how, as a formal, semi-formal political movement, this stuff has gone from the margins to the mainstream. But just as importantly, and this is something that I have always written about when dealing with this subject, is that progression and that growth of far-right populism has only really happened because of weaknesses within the traditional political mainstream, and particularly as we've got into the 2020s, growing social and economic pressures that open up much more of an opportunity for that kind of politics. So the social and economic pressures, as briefly as I can, in a country like the UK, we could start perhaps with the 2008 financial crisis, as you mentioned. Like in many other parts of the world, that caused hardship, but it also made people very angry, not just about their material circumstances, but about, at least as many people saw it, the fact that politics seemed stuck. Traditional governing elites were proposing solutions to the financial crisis in its aftermath that either seemed ineffective or to actually make things worse. So in Britain, the exemplar of that is austerity, the very, very severe form of austerity that was introduced by the government of David Cameron, who was the Conservative Party leader in 2010. So that took huge amounts of resources out of the public sphere. Public services had their budgets cut, local government had its budget cut, and at the same time did not revive the economy in a very convincing way. So Britain's had this problem since the 2008 financial crash, that money's been taken out of public services, but people's wages by and large haven't been going up either. So in real terms, wages have stayed roughly flat for the past 15 years or so. So all of that, I think, is a recipe for a country in which people feel that life is getting harder, that the future is not necessarily likely to be an improvement on the past, that things simply don't work as well as they used to. So, public services not working is one big thing. But if you take lots of money out of local government, in Britain, local government is responsible for things like cleaning the streets, cutting the grass, running community centres that keep elderly people connected to the people around them, or support families with young children. All of those things get cut away. You don't just see kind of obvious things like the trains don't run on time anymore, but also just, I think it contributes to this feeling that society is becoming unmoored. And then you have this anger at the politicians held responsible for that. And like you mentioned, a lot of that anger and discontent was not expressed in terms favourable to far-right populists. You had in Britain a huge anti-austerity protest movement involving trade unions, students, many other people in the early 2010s. In other parts of the world that were hit by similar economic difficulties, you saw similar. But you then also did have the right trying to build that into a movement that took some of that discontent, but shaped it very heavily around the theme of immigration, the idea that it was immigration that was responsible for that feeling of society coming apart, that the betrayal of the elites or the ineffectiveness of the governing class was directly linked to the fact that immigration was happening, and they seemed to either encourage it or at least fail to control it in the way that they promised. So I think all of those factors played a huge role in boosting the growth of far-right politics over the last 10 to 15 years. And then you have the mistakes and failures of mainstream politics itself, which perhaps we can come back to talk about in more detail in a bit. But really, I think you have seen the inability of governing elites to recognize that their established way of doing things no longer works, however it might have worked in the past. And for a country like Britain, but also for the US, for Western Europe, for quite a lot of other places, that really means the governing ideology of neoliberalism, which, again, we can talk about in more detail if we need to. But for me, it's not just about economic policies, but this reigning mentality, this received wisdom that the markets know best, that government can't do much more than keep the economy ticking over and let the market do its work. Whatever its strengths and weaknesses before the 2008 crash, afterwards it's just been repeatedly exposed as bankrupt and completely unsuited to the challenges that we face. And then the other kind of big weakness among traditional governing elites, I think, was more to do with the business of politics, their kind of way of behaving tactically, where there's this very established pattern of seeing a challenge from the right, in Britain, in the West, very often over the politics of immigration, and thinking, right, what we need to do to head off that challenge is to meet the demands halfway. So to play this game of anti-immigration politics, of sort of trying to do two things at once, which would be to keep running an economy that structurally relies on migration to fill skills gaps and labour shortages, but to echo the mood music of the anti-immigration right and say, well, this happens, but we really don't like it, so we're going to do all of these restrictive things to make you, the voter who's a bit wary of immigration, feel secure. And over the long term, that political tactic, I think, has just accelerated the degeneration of political debate on immigration, and has just massively moved the terms of debate onto territory favourable to far-right populists.
Okay. Now you mentioned immigration, and that's obviously, it comes out in almost every major television debate about politics in this country and many others. You've mentioned Nigel Farage, you've mentioned the BNP. Take us through, I mean, there'd be people listening to this, and there are some obviously much more familiar with the subject matter and others that are not, right? We now see, the EDL, and we see Tommy Robinson, and you see these Unite the Kingdom marches occurring. What happened to the BNP? What did they morph into? Where does Nigel Farage come from? Tell us some of that so we can understand sort of the history of who these fanatics are.
Yeah, so in Britain, for much of the post-Second World War period, the kind of main actors on the far right were far-right extremists. They were people who were trying to revive some form of fascism. And for that reason, their success had a fairly tight limit, because that's an incredibly unpopular form of politics if you present it openly like that to people in Britain and to people in most other countries around the world. But as I was saying before, the far right contains a broader collection of currents and movements. And as well as that, there have always been hardline conservatives who, for whatever reason, find themselves outside of the mainstream centre-right, and single-issue campaigners and activists who, will engage in agitation, but not have a fully fledged set of ideas behind it necessarily. And I think since around 2010, we've seen those latter parts really take over and become the driving force to the right of mainstream politics. That's partly because of changing times. I think it was clear by the 2000s that kind of post-war fascist tradition had failed. People involved in it either thought, this isn't working, we need to sound like we think something different, or people who might once have been attracted to it just thought, what's the point in getting involved in that? It's going nowhere. So Tommy Robinson is a very good example of that. So he is Britain's most prominent far-right influencer. He's been active politically since the late 2000s. Mainly as a single-issue anti-Muslim campaigner. He emerged as a figurehead of the English Defence League, which was a street protest movement drawn from football hooligan circles in 2009, 2010. the emergence of the EDL was actually directly triggered by an Islamic fundamentalist protest at a homecoming parade for British soldiers in Luton, where Tommy Robinson is from. So a small group of fundamentalists held up insulting placards. People in the town were angry about that. There was a backlash, and the EDL became the kind of the shape of that backlash within the space of a few weeks. Tommy Robinson had already been interested in far-right politics at that point. He had actually briefly got involved with the BNP because they were still around at that stage, but left quite quickly. He says because, you know, he had black friends, and the BNP had this like very unreconstructed hardline biological racism. You know, they were overtly white supremacist movement, and he didn't like that by his account. And Robinson and the EDL managed to kind of move away from the BNP's way of doing things and forge a new way of doing far-right politics in the UK. And I would argue a kind of a new articulation of racism that was more attuned to the times. So the BNP, as I think you can tell from my account, I think were always very stuck in the 20th century. They collapsed as a party after the 2010 general election, where after having won, you know, scores of seats in local government, they said their aim was set on winning a seat at Westminster. They overextended themselves, failed. The party collapsed amid infighting, and I think a lot of people there were just disillusioned and thought that's not the way. You know, that's not worth our time anymore. At exactly that moment, the EDL emerged, and what it showed was there was a lot more potential success for a movement that didn't have all of that neo-Nazi fascist baggage, that was organised in a much looser way. So it was never a political party. Effectively, if you wanted to be a quote-unquote member of the EDL, all you needed to do was turn up on one of its demonstrations. You know, and those demonstrations were organised through football hooligan forums and Facebook groups, and you didn't need to there was no price of entry, and no price for leaving either. So people could turn up, take part in it, move away from it as they pleased. And also, being a single issue movement, at least at the start, you know, purportedly being against Islamic extremism, but in reality being heavily anti-Muslim, was, I would say, a way of expressing racist ideas, you know, ideas about some inherent civilizational difference between Islam and the West, the inherent superiority of Western culture and ideas, a kind of conspiracy theory that Islam and Muslims presented this enemy within societies like the UK's. You know, all of that to me has the shape and effect of racism, but fits much more with current popular attitudes and understanding here in the UK and in much of the West, which is that racism as a form of prejudice against people on the basis of skin colour, and the idea that people slot neatly into these different biologically determined races that can be ordered in a hierarchy, is wrong, immoral, and to be despised. You know, I think in Britain, if you look at opinion polls, there's a very strong popular understanding on that basis. The trouble is, race is not fixed, you know, because there is no real biological basis for the idea that humans can be divided up according to their genetics that map onto differences in skin colour, and that will tell you something meaningful about differences between those groups of people. You know, that just isn't true. We know enough about human genetics now to see that. So what race and racism have always been about are ways of ordering human beings into hierarchies. And that process, the process of racialization, is still very much with us. You know, so it's to be anti-racist, say, it's not simply good enough to say, I reject that biological understanding of racism and prejudice against people based on skin color and so on, and the legacies of these things, which are obviously still very much with us and still damaging, you have to go beyond that. You have to actually recognize that racialization is a process that can be applied to new groups of people. People can be scooped up by politicians or by the media or by social attitudes in general, shoved into new categories and stigmatized and labeled as inferior or threatening. And something that happened in the West, really sort of from the early 2000s onwards, was that you saw racist ideas and attitudes and ideology being very strongly applied to certain groups of people who may have been targeted by it in the past, but this was a kind of new way of kind of racializing people and forming these groups. So one would be Muslims in the wake of 9/11 and the pursuit of the US-led war on terror. Another would be new immigrants to a country like the UK, where there was a lot of xenophobia, but that I think increasingly has been shaped into actually openly racist ideas about new immigrants to the UK and the supposed threat they pose to national culture, and also more specifically refugees and asylum seekers, where that has been kind of treated as a separate issue from immigration as a whole, and a whole load of racializing and racist ideas have been applied to refugees as a group. And so these things are very, very present in British society and politics. And it's with that material that a movement like the EDL and Tommy Robinson's activity subsequently, and far-right populist parties like UKIP and then the Brexit Party and then Reform, have played with to mould a new kind of far-right politics.
Okay, so I mean, just to pick up on what you said, so it's sort of dehumanization of various categories of human beings, pinning it on their culture or what's their perceived civilizational behavior, if such a thing exists, in order to, and then the denouncement of we deny the fact that we are racist, or that this is target against black people or brown people or anyone else, because this is not about skin tones, it's about culture, it's about identity, that kind of thing. Now, one of the things you say in the book, and we'll come a bit back, we'll kind of go forward and come back again to some of the phonetics, right? But one of the things you speak about in the book, you speak about Cameron's government in 2010 and how that was very, very difficult, very different to the last Tory government of Rishi Sunak in 2024. Tell us, beyond the fact that the one was led by a white face and the one by a brown face, which is interesting given the trajectory of the society. Tell us why those governments were so different.
So David Cameron won power in 2010, posing as probably the most socially liberal leader of the Conservative Party in history. The Conservative Party are Britain's established traditional centre-right party. They're also the most effective election-winning machine in British political history. In the last 150 years, the Conservatives have formed a government for the majority of those years by far. And one reason they're so successful is they're very adaptable. And what Cameron was doing in 2010 was adapting to his surrounding circumstances, which was we had had over a decade of government by the Labour Party, but more specifically by what Tony Blair, the Labour leader, called New Labour, which was a form of centre-left politics that took all of the gains of social liberalism of previous decades, being comfortable with multiculturalism, with gay rights, with feminism and so on, and also adapting the centre-left's economic politics to something much more centrist, much more in line with neoliberal governing ideology. And Cameron presented himself as a continuation of that because, it was less popular by the end of the Labour's time in government, but New Labour were a very popular, very successful electoral movement. And, Cameron, he did photo ops as he was campaigning for election as leader of the opposition. He visited the Arctic and was photographed being dragged by huskies on a sled across the Arctic to signal his concern for the climate, which wasn't a traditional conservative centre-right issue. He talked about how people should, in his words at the time, hug a hoodie, which was, he said, we should be more understanding and sympathetic to working class young people who get involved in crime. he and his government, in fact, brought in gay marriage. So there was a degree of commitment to these things, but where it began to come apart almost immediately was on the territory of immigration, where Cameron didn't have that much to say about it at first, but in 2010, just before the general election, made this promise that a Conservative government would reduce net migration, which is essentially the overall figure for the number of people arriving to live in the country each year. He would reduce it to the tens of thousands. And at the time, net migration to the UK was something like 250 to 300,000 a year. So that implies a really significant reduction in the level of immigration, but had absolutely no clear policy for how you would achieve such a reduction, because let's remember first of all that the vast majority of immigration to a country like the UK is legal. So in effect the government has invited those people to come and live and work or study in Britain. That's happened almost entirely for economic reasons, because economic factors demand it, or policymakers have decided that it would be beneficial to Britain's economy for these types of immigration to happen. So if you are proposing a drastic cut to that, you're actually also proposing drastic economic changes if you're really sincere about following through on what you promise. The Cameron government didn't have any such proposals. In fact, as we were talking about earlier, what they really were trying to do was revive neoliberalism post the financial crash. These big austerity cuts that would somehow return growth to the UK, would revive the free market, allow Britain to continue being driven largely by market forces and so on. So in the absence of having any serious plan for how you might achieve much lower levels of migration to the UK, or indeed an argument for why that would be desirable, because one way to achieve much lower levels of migration to an open capitalist economy like the UK's is to crash the economy. That's the quick way to do it. You can tank the economy and then people won't come to work here anymore. But clearly that's not a desirable course of action. So there was none of this was part of the Cameron government's plan, was part of the debate and so on. What you had instead was them leaning very heavily into anti-immigration rhetoric of certain sorts. So Cameron actually always had a very kind of strong critical line on what he described as the failures of multiculturalism, which was always kind of, it wasn't always openly said, but very clear that was always sort of pointed at Muslim communities in Britain, was a way of heading off the threat from the Islamophobic far right, for instance. But also with the regular mainstream immigration system, he instituted this set of policies known as the hostile environment. So these were policies intended to encourage unauthorized migrants, people in the UK without permission, to leave the UK of their own accord, which was a kind of classic mix of an austerity policy and the politics of anti-immigration all at once, because in keeping with the spirit of the times, Cameron was trying to reduce the role of the state in a function that had traditionally been carried out by the state. So, border control, deporting people, or at least kind of giving them incentives to leave the country would have been something the Home Office, Britain's Interior Ministry, was responsible for. The hostile environment was an attempt to outsource many of its functions to wider society. So its policies included things like giving a legal duty to landlords and employers, and even the driver's license agency to check the immigration status of their prospective customers or employees. And if they couldn't prove they had the right to live in the UK, they were to be refused service. So, it has now become impossible to rent a house in the UK, to rent a place to live, unless you can show documents to prove that you've got the right to reside in the UK. That was one of the hostile environment policies brought in by the Cameron government. So what this did was very little to change the overall figures on how many unauthorized migrants were in the country, were leaving the country, and so on, but was very successful at spreading the idea that illegal immigration, as the right would put it, is existential threat to the UK. And it also caused huge amounts of harm to immigrant communities because, I mean, this is a subject that I report on a lot as a journalist as well, the politics of migration, the realities of life for people within the immigration systems and for refugees and so on. And anyone familiar with that territory, anybody who has grown up in a family or a community where immigration is part of life, knows that people always kind of slip through the gaps. Your life circumstances don't always necessarily fit what it says on paper they should be, and you're not necessarily in exactly the right place at the right time, even when you're trying to follow all of the rules. And so instituting much harsher policies, more punitive policies to make life really hard for people in those corners of the immigration system just spreads misery around the country at large. And one result of that actually was the Windrush scandal in 2018, where it turned out that the British government had been wrongly stripping people from the Commonwealth, so former colonies of the British Empire, of the right to live and work and have housing in the UK. You know, many of them were elderly people from the Caribbean who, say, had worked their whole lives in the NHS, in the National Health Service in Britain, got to old age and then were told, oh, well, you don't have the right bit of paper, so we're going to throw you out on the street now or deport you to Jamaica. So that is how the Cameron government dealt with all of these various factors from when they came into power in 2010. And the way that I see it, that just, I mean, it both kind of riled people up further. It said, yes, we agree that immigration is this pressing national emergency that you should think of as something criminal and threatening and harmful to society. Our promise is that we'll control it for you. And then they did a bunch of things that almost did the opposite. And that, to me, opens up space for hugely toxic immigration politics and for political movements and parties that can say, well, look, there's the elites, they're betraying you, listen to us, we've got the real solutions to this, whether it's join my street protest movement against Islam or vote for Brexit or vote for Nigel Farage to be our next Prime Minister.
Now, I'm not British. I've been living here for about 2 years. The British government has invited me here to be employed, and just, I mean, so I obviously have been a journalist for a long time, so I've been following British politics, but I'm not an insider as such. So, in a way, this may be a healthy conversation because I guess our audience, among them Brits and non-Brits, would possibly be in the same basket of knowledge as me. When I look at just my experience in the UK for the last 2 years. So it was clear that there was a failing Conservative government. I mean, it was people outside of Britain. It was probably a joke inside of Britain as well. It was like, you know, you're going through a new prime minister, sometimes every month, sometimes, you know, a few in a few years. And it was clear that that government was not going to last an election. And Labour came and really swept the election. I think maybe not surprising, but I mean, I don't think anyone was like, you know, it was a very significant victory. And literally just there's a local election that occurs a year and a half, 18 months to 24 months since that election, and Labour's decimated. Now there's a bunch of reasons. It's not just, you know, the rise of reform. It's own incompetence, you know, not having leadership as such. There's a bunch of reasons, but just sticking on this particular reason, the rise of reform and these parties, and basically decimated an election. And suddenly, you know, just in electoral numbers, not in polling numbers, this party, which had, you know, like from 150 councillors to now almost 1,500 councillors. And they're not, again, like I say, they're not the only party that's risen, but they're definitely the party that's gotten the most seats. It just seems a bit like, you know, weird, right? Explain to me how Nigel Farage, who is clearly the victor, you know, if you go back from 2016 until now in electoral politics, explain to me how he takes advantage of all of this. And a part of that explanation is probably how the Tories continue to fail. But specifically on the problem that you just mentioned, that Cameron kind of starts by not really addressing what he said he would address.
Yeah, so you asked just before actually how we got from Cameron all the way to Rishi
Yes.
Sunak and then this situation where we are with reform. And I think the next thing to come into play, so you had the Cameron government, I would say, dreadfully mishandling the politics of immigration, but also, I mean, just its response to the 2008 financial crisis really just caused a huge amount of social and cultural damage in Britain as well. The next phase of which was the increasing fragmentation of British politics and a kind of failure of nerve by the governing class, where they became unable to govern. The Brexit referendum in 2016, which was partly won by the Leave campaign out by appealing to a sense of frustration with austerity as well as immigration and so on, that polarized politics. So it, we've been very used in Britain to having this traditional centre-left, centre-right distinction, embodied by the Labour and the Conservative parties. Brexit redrew the electoral map because it became about, well, did you vote for Leave or did you vote for Remain? And the real prize electorally was who could scoop up all of the Leave voters, because where they sat geographically around the UK, combined with the UK's first past the post electoral system, meant that a nimble politician could win a lot of seats in Parliament by appealing to people who had voted Leave in the 2016 referendum. Boris Johnson did that in 2019, but he proved himself completely unable to govern. So, he won this thumping election victory in 2019, promising not only to get Brexit done, but to appeal to the sentiment of former Labour voters who had switched to the Tories because they'd voted for Brexit, partly out of these frustrations I was talking about, but also a kind of deeper sense that Britain was better when it had been a social democracy. So in the years before neoliberalism, when we had control over our railways and our electricity and our water, and there were good solid industrial jobs and all of that. Boris Johnson made people think he was going to bring some of that back. Did nothing of the sort. His political career nosedived. You then had that brief Liz Truss interlude where she tried to just revive Thatcherism, the first flush of neoliberalism, and do it kind of even harder and faster with the devastating economic backlash that prompted. And then Rishi Sunak kind of presiding over the ruins and seeing out the term of that Conservative government. All the while, leaving these groups of people in the country who had been frustrated for a long time, had been told by successive groups of politicians from the mainstream, we understand your frustration, we're on your side, we're going to sort this out for you, and seeing nothing done and nothing, or at least as they perceived it, nothing improve and nothing change. And I think really that's where Reform's rise comes from. So they were originally named the Brexit Party. In 2019, their purpose was to ensure that Boris Johnson's government got elected on as hard a Brexit position as possible, because Britain was still negotiating its withdrawal from the EU at that point. But then a few years after, in the early 2020s, the party was renamed Reform, and there was an effort to turn it into a broader electoral project that could actually have a chance of I suppose at first they probably just wanted some political influence, but then as the Conservative Party disintegrated, the ambition became to replace the Conservative Party as the main force on the right of British politics. And so that collapse of the what remained of the Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, Sunak government, gave them a huge boost. I think they got about 15 or 16% of the vote in the 2024 general election. But then they've gone even further than that as a result of the Labour government, who came in on, in terms of seats, a very convincing electoral victory in 2024. The Labour government being unable to deliver the change that it promised voters, to deliver the improvements to the functioning of public services, of the daily quality of life, of people's earning capacity that they had said that they were going to bring in 2024. And so Reform have benefited hugely from the discontent that's flourished in the last couple of years. Again, as we were talking about earlier, that discontent has not broken entirely to the right. You've also seen the rise of the Green Party, who've taken a strongly left-wing position. And actually, both the Greens and Reform at the moment tend to be picking up support from less well-off voters who are feeling the pressures of the cost of living more strongly, whereas the voters that have stayed with the Labour and Conservative parties tend to be more affluent and not be feeling the pinch quite as strongly. But obviously Reform, as well as picking up on those general frustrations and some economic frustrations, are campaigning very heavily on the idea that, the single issue threatening the UK and symbolising the failure of elites is immigration. And I think that trajectory, I've talked about the UK a lot specifically here, partly because that's what I've been writing about most recently, partly because I think it's good to talk about specifics. But this trajectory, that kind of soup of discontents, the way that the far right has exploited failures in the mainstream and bundled it all into this argument around immigration and identity and elites, is a process that we have seen in many other countries, in Europe, in North America, in Asia and other parts of the world.
One of the other differences, I think, between a Sunak government and the government of Cameron is just the weaponization of language. Now, in the book, you actually quote something from Suella Braverman, where she says, it's right in the start of the book, where you say, the Britain that I love, she said this in 2026, the Britain that I love is being ripped apart by diversity, equality and inclusion. And I'm sure if we go through the statements of various members of government, or for specifically the last 5 years, there's many that you could probably, at least quote or semi-quote. Tell me why that rhetoric became this way and how that feeds into sort of reforms project.
Yeah, so I think, Britain has, for well over a century, been dominated by a right-wing press. So right-wing rhetoric and ideas being present at the very top of politics is not new. Some of the strongest anti-immigration propaganda over the years has come from newspapers like the Daily Mail. But what's happened in the last 5 to 10 years is that you have seen the rapid encroachment on mainstream political discourse of something more extreme, more conspiratorial, that evokes more of a sense of there being this existential threat. So diversity, equality and inclusion is just the right's latest kind of name for what they used to call political correctness. The right has attacked social liberalism. Parts of the right have for years and years. The language they do it in now is this kind of overheated, I think quite conspiratorial way of talking about it. So Suella Braverman, she used to also talk about quote unquote cultural Marxism, which is a thing you'll see her equivalents on the right in the US and many other countries talking about. The idea of cultural Marxism, which is that there's been this kind of long-term conspiracy by Marxist intellectuals, who couldn't get the revolution they wanted via politics, to inculcate subversive left-wing ideas in the minds of the young via universities, via critical theory and all of that. That's actually a conspiracy theory that has its origins in the extreme right and is linked to the fact that a whole bunch of Marxist intellectuals associated with the Frankfurt School, who all came to the US and did work in the US after the Second World War, like Theodor Adorno, Horkheimer and so on, that most of them were Jewish. And there is an overlap between seeing it as a kind of Marxist conspiracy and a kind of classic sort of anti-Semitic view of these Jews, a cabal of Jews, conspiring to subvert the West. So that's where that idea comes from. It was, it's something I was familiar with having reported on those extreme corners of the far right for years. But it was only in the late 2010s you suddenly saw politicians at the level of Suella Braverman start using the phrase. And that's not, it's not to share that's not to say that she shares the anti-Semitic ideas that other people who formulated that theory do. I mean, she frequently trumpets her opposition to anti-Semitism. But the fact that an idea like that could even circulate at that level of politics, at the top of the Conservative Party, illustrates the kind of change that I think happened. Good question is, why did that happen? And I think for this, I'll just try and pull out of our focus on British politics for a minute, because, as we were talking about earlier, these changes that we've discussed, they're not unique to Britain. I think you could pick pretty much any liberal democracy in the world at the moment, and there would be a version of this politics happening or gaining influence. And there are local factors that obviously kind of have helped encourage it. but they're not present everywhere. So immigration, for instance, I think in the West, we kind of automatically start thinking about immigration when we think about the far right, because the far right makes it its main campaigning theme so often. But it's not always true, not even in Europe or the Americas. In Poland, for example, the Law and Justice Party won a general election in 2015 when Poland was mostly a country of emigration. You know, immigration in the way that we're used to having it talked about here in the UK was not an issue at that point, certainly not as prominent an issue. I think in Brazil, Bolsonaro, you know, anti-immigration politics were not a massive part of what he was talking about. I think he was much more focused on kind of encouraging hatred of the left and very reactionary gender politics and so on. Likewise, economically, although the 2008 financial crash had a huge influence on how politics has unfolded in the West, in India, you had the rise of a far-right populist, Narendra Modi, during a period of extraordinary economic growth for India. So it kind of tells you that there's something about this kind of politics that precedes all of these contingent factors. And for that, I think you have to actually think about what it's doing emotionally. So right-wing nationalism is, first of all, always about the nation. And it's always about the idea of a nation as a coherent community. In its more extreme forms, very often kind of conceived of as a body that is under threat. But even when it's not articulated in those ways, it's still always the idea that the nation is this thing that needs to be protected from external and internal threats. The threats that the far right focuses on are always, when you come down to it, kind of elemental and bodily. So whether it's immigration, whether it's LGBT rights, whether, to take an example from India, it's mixed Muslim-Hindu marriages, it is always about things to do with sex, birth or death, presenting this kind of fundamental threat to the nation's survival. You know, that immigration is not just about resources. You know, if we have immigration, where will people be housed? How will we maintain a functioning health service if there's more demand, and so on? You know, those things come into it. But for the far right, there's always this extra emotional charge, which is like, this is going to destroy us, this will kill us, or it will make us weak. You know, it will weaken our menfolk, or what's the phrase that's used in India by Hindu nationalists? Love jihad.
Love
you know,
jihad.
that I think for me that's a really striking example of this. That whatever else far-right politics is about, it is about these underlying emotional drives that far-right nationalists are always trying to excite. And I think that the encroachment of this more extreme language into mainstream politics, or of politicians with these more extreme ideas into positions of power in parts of the world, is because they have successfully managed to bundle up a whole load of resentments that relate to real economic and social pressures out there in the world, but turn it into this heavily emotionally driven, heavily potentially destructive drive to defend the nation, you know, to revive our strength, nationalists, make us great again. You know, all these phrases that we're now used to hearing really kind of home in on that. And they have been given the opportunity to do that, not only by social and economic factors in the way we've discussed, but also changes in communication technology. I think, you know, politics has drastically changed as a result of the internet. Forms of political organization are changing in ways that I think none of us quite have our heads around yet. We all know it's happening. I don't think anybody quite understands what's going on. And for the moment, it's very often the far right that have proved the most innovative and entrepreneurial when it comes to new ways of doing politics. So Tommy Robinson, who I mentioned earlier, you know, first of all, he moved away from that traditional fascist political movement, membership-based party way of doing far-right politics, and had this loosely held together street movement organized through Facebook and internet forums. He then moved a step on from that in the later 2000s, where he quit as the later 2010s rather, where he'd left the English Defence League and was essentially a standalone influencer. He no longer even needed a street movement behind him to have political impact. What he just needed was a Twitter account and a Facebook account and so on. And a politician like Nigel Farage, I think, has pioneered a fusion of like the old way of doing politics and the new way. So Farage, in some respects, is a very traditional British politician. You know, he got into politics in around 1990 because he wanted Britain to leave Europe. It was a very unpopular cause at that point. So he spent most of the 90s traveling up and down the country, speaking to meetings of people in person, trying to convince them of something they weren't probably that interested in. So a real old school stump speaker. You know, he went out there and he talked to people. That's why he's got such a kind of easy manner when you see him on TV. He then became a very good television performer. Again, you know, how old? 70, 80 years worth of that being a way of doing politics in the West. But in the last 5 to 10 years, he's also become an internet celebrity. He's made himself into one deliberately. So there was a period until quite recently where Farage was by far the most followed and watched British politician on TikTok. He also, you know, he's come to attention in the news recently because for several years he was also making videos on that platform Cameo. Which, if you're not familiar with, is it's a sort of social app where users pay celebrities to read out messages on their behalf. So, you know, you might get a celebrity to say happy birthday to a friend of yours. Farage was a prolific user of that, including in his first year in Parliament. And he was making fairly serious amounts of money from it, tens of thousands of pounds a year. But B, it just kind of adds to this aura of internet celebrity influencer that has now become central. I mean, it's central to the far right's way of doing politics, but they were just a little bit ahead of the curve, I think, because it's now central to everybody's way of doing politics. And so those changes as well, and the fact that extremist and far right and conspiratorial ideas and language can now circulate freely between the fringes and the mainstream via a platform like Elon Musk's X in a way that just wasn't possible before these things existed, have all contributed to the mainstream of far right discourse in politics, and also the mainstream itself moving rightwards.
Okay, there's a few things I want to touch upon. So I want to discuss more sort of what you talked about, the global weaponization of cultural erasure by indigenous looking people, right? Sort of to spark this fear of the other or the immigration, and to basically destroy what has almost been an ongoing project since the beginning of humankind, of multiculturalism, right? In various, you know, sometimes receding, sometimes, you know, going forward. And then also just sort of how that coincides with the failure of globalization to actually deliver economic gains. Now there's a chart here in front of me, and it just sort of shows how the top 1%, how they in a country, how their total capture of wealth has changed from 1990 to 2025. And in the UK, the 1% or the top 1% owned 17% of the resources in 1990. Today they own 35%. That's pretty crazy. In India, it was 16%. Now it's 40%. In Italy, it's 17% and 25%. In Brazil, it's 45 and 49%. In the US, it's not that stark. It's 29 to 31%, but you have seen a much bigger increase in the top 10% and how much they sort of control of the wealth there. Now, at the same time, it's like, you know, it is very clear that, you know, we had this massive 2 big world wars, which was sort of the dying pains of the birth of nationalism. And then this project for globalization began. It began with international institutions. You know, various trade barriers were obviously systematically unfair, but were opened up to sort of stimulate economic trade and growth and travel. And so people were traveling a lot, and people were settling in new countries, etc. And as economic failure started occurring for the average person due to, you know, capitalism becoming rampant and naturally enabling capital, not labor, right? So people and at the very top, and your elites and not everyone else. You had this weaponization of cultural erasure, which also seems to coincides with, because as your train is breaking down, you also see that there's more people who don't look like you around, and there's more people who cook different food to you around. And so your brain thinks one's happening because of the other even though you enjoy the food that they may be cooking, or you may enjoy the friendship you may have with the casual person down the street who looks differently from you, right? Now, what's also interesting, and just with that as a background, because sort of it summarizes what you've said, another stat which I found very interesting in your book, and it's in the beginning of the chapter on cowards, is that 7% of people who are privately educated in Britain, which means going to public school in Britain, which is weird. I always find it weird that you call a public school a private school. Actually hold 60% of elite, positions in corporates or in media or in the government. Explain how that has, just accelerated this as well.
Well, I think the point you make about wealth inequality is absolutely crucial, and it also goes some way to answering that question that I raised earlier of, well, why is it that a country hit by the 2008 financial crisis produces a leader like Donald Trump, and a country that really did quite well out of the last 15 years produces a leader like Narendra Modi, who, although the economic circumstances are quite different, are basically playing on the same themes. And I think that's to do with this huge rise in inequality, because if, as I've said before, these are politicians who, they basically feed off resentment. What is one of the main drivers of resentment in a society where people have been told you're either a winner or a loser? You either get rich or you're a loser. There's no such thing as the public good. And if you are poor or unfortunate, it's your own fault. Well, if a society becomes very unequal and that kind of ideology is dominant, people are really going to resent their failures in life, and the language they have for, well, not even failures, just, resent the fact that they feel like they're not getting enough of the pie. That their neighbours might be doing better than them, and if they are, then that's probably because they're doing something wrong or unfair, or it's unfair that this group of people get something and our group doesn't. We have globally created societies where those kind of resentments flourish and fester, and in the absence of I would say of a politics based on solidarity, which at least in Western Europe is what the centre left used to offer. The far right's explanation for all of this, and its target for resentment and its logic bringing these different things together, is what wins out. So for me, that kind of underlies everything globally. Then when you get to a country like the UK, you've got a complicated situation where the huge increase in wealth inequality has produced a new elite. The 1% are people with huge amounts of money. They may well have come from traditionally elite backgrounds in Britain, but they probably come from lots of other places as well. It's no secret that the UK, London specifically, for years has been a clearinghouse for illicitly obtained Russian money, for instance. The people buying the luxury flats that line the River Thames are not necessarily people from the UK, although many of them are. So you've got this kind of new elite that has kind of hoarded an increasing share of the wealth. And then you've got the traditional elite, because Britain has always, or for centuries, been a very elitist country. And the way those two things interact is chaotic and I think partly responsible for causing this kind of breakdown in the ability of the traditional governing class to govern. So as you say, for instance, establishment jobs in Britain, jobs running political institutions, cultural institutions, draw on people from traditionally very elite backgrounds, people who've been to private school in the UK. That's been the case for years. But what's happened more recently is that there's been a kind of shifting around of the values that those elites believe themselves to hold, and also their idea of like, well, what is it we're here to do? We're the governing elite. We're here to govern, but for what? You know, under New Labour, for instance, you know, the governments of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, which were in power from the late 90s to 2010, I think there was an idea that the elite was there to welcome globalization. Tony Blair once gave this famous speech in which he countered critics of globalization, who then largely came from the left, I should say, because they said it was unfair and would increase inequality, yes, and so on. He said, what's the point of complaining about globalization? You might as well complain that autumn follows summer, you know. So they really treated it as just a fact of life. And their whole idea was, well, the elite was there to, you know, the traditional governing elite was there to kind of oversee this process and to make sure that we reaped the benefits. So we reaped the benefits of the increased cosmopolitanism you get with global corporations, global trade, a higher degree of human movement, although it has never been free. As somebody who's reported on the violence done by European border control to refugees crossing the Mediterranean for many years, I bristle at the idea that we ever had a kind of true freedom of movement here in Europe, and to redirect some of the profits towards, you know, the neediest in society, or to fund public services and so on. So that was kind of what the elites thought they were there to do. In fact, the thing that sums it up for me the most neatly is an episode of that US TV series, The West Wing, you know, which is about the fictional president played by Martin Sheen, facing moral and political dilemmas as he tries to govern and discussing them with his White House team. And there's, you know, that I can't remember exactly when that started, but it kind of began in the heyday of globalization. And by the time the show finished in the late 2000s, things weren't looking so rosy. You know, the war on terror was underway, the economy was not looking so good, and so on. And in one of those later series, and the later series I think are really good because they get quite dark, and you can sort of feel the writers of the show wrestling with this fact that the world isn't going the way we thought it would. How do we deal with this in the show? And there's an episode where some representatives of a white-collar workers' union come to see the president's chief of staff, and they say, our jobs in IT are being outsourced to India. Why can't you do anything about it? And the chief of staff says, well, you know, that's globalization. You know, that's what happens. And they say, but we thought the deal in America was we left behind our blue-collar jobs, and those would be outsourced, and in return we would get these better white-collar jobs. You know, it was never part of the deal that the white-collar jobs would also go elsewhere in the world. And you know, they have quite a serious discussion among the president's staff about this. Like, yeah, this is really bad. It wasn't what was planned. You know, globalization, it might not be so good for the American worker after all. And the moral of the show is that they solemnly decide, well, that's just the way of the world, and then go back to the union representatives and make them understand that it's the way of the world as well. And the union representatives are very sad about it, but they basically accept it and go home. You know, that to me is the governing mentality of the elites that held sway all the way up to around 2016, when you had the big populist upsets in the West. And since then, you have had far-right populists kind of mount this backlash to the sort of social gains of globalization, you know, increased social liberalism, trying to tie that to a critique of economic globalization. So, you know, in the British context, that was the whole argument against EU free movement and being part of the EU was, well, that's part of globalization. It's not to the advantage of the ordinary British citizen, because the immigration undermines their wages, but also undermines their sense of national identity and integrity and so on. But the elites don't understand that, because they're all telling us to love multiculturalism and so on and so on. But what the far right also does is try to preserve as much of the economic setup that drove globalization as possible. You know, Trump, for instance, he might well be trying to break up aspects of the international system and make America a bit more protectionist. But he still wants American capitalism to have free reign over the world. He still wants to let the market rip. I think in a British context, Nigel Farage is emblematic of this. You know, in his professional career, before he got involved in politics, he was a city trader in the City of London. He arrived in the City of London at precisely the moment of deregulation, you know, one of the big early neoliberal reforms in the 1980s that turned the City of London from a slightly fusty British public school dominated institution to this massive international clearinghouse that helps the wealthy get even wealthier. He did very well out of that. He likes that. He wants to preserve an economic system that allows people like him to do that and get even wealthier, but he wants to do it on altered cultural and social terms. And I think that, in a way, represents the defenders of free market capitalism seeing all of this resentment that is generated by huge wealth inequalities, the failure of neoliberal governance, and coming up with a solution that allows them to preserve as much of this unequal and damaging system as possible. The trade-off being either we'll just make you feel better about your national identity, or, crucially, we'll take revenge on some other group of people on your behalf.
I want to pick up on what you said, but then I just want to then move on to some of your, solutions for how we push back against this, but also maybe just ask you to peer a bit into the future. But just if you take the West Wing sort of metaphor that you used, and this fear that, the blue collar jobs are supposed to go to India or some other part of the world in the global south, and we're supposed to keep the white collar jobs. And then you mentioned Farage's background in finance in London, and it's almost like he wants to build a world where that actually does happen. So he can maintain all the white collar jobs in the UK, and there is a form of economic globalization that occurs, and the blue collar jobs move elsewhere. Now, the reality is, when you think about the world, you have a rising China, you have an India which is increasingly prosperous. And I think this is something that their identitarian politics has not yet realized, that no, the world's changing, that there are massively great skills out there in the world. The West no longer has, or it's decreasing its monopoly on skilled expertise. AI is going to be a massive game changer in that, and a lot of the key AI thinking is even coming out of China. But it's not just that. I mean, software skills in India, and I mean, I say this as someone who's lived not in the West, but of the Western world, that, believe me, I really rank skills outside of the US and the UK often more than I, just in my own anecdotal experience, than I, through working with journalists from other parts of the world, or accountants or anywhere else. So there's massive skills elsewhere. So they're not factoring this in, right? They're also not factoring what you just said earlier on, that, making immigrants leave is just going to be a failed economic project. Like, it's just very difficult to see how countries like the UK will continue the level of services they have if, immigrants leave. The NHS will suffer. There'll be all sorts of... What's your response to that?
Yeah, well, I think in the West, far-right populism at the moment has got a very conflicted response to these questions. And it's a couple of things are going on at once, and none of them has won out yet. So I suppose one response is seeing what you've described and thinking we need to get back on top. So I would say that Trumpism is the most prominent expression of that. And I mean, America being the global hegemon, it makes sense it would be like that in that country. But J.D. Vance was quite open about it about a year ago. He said the point of globalization was never that other countries would overtake us, and that's why we're now against it. There's a bit of that in the UK. So I think, there are, if we just think about Farage's party Reform, I think there are some kind of unreconstructed neoliberals who just sort of are looking for a way to revive things economically in that fashion. And yes, it's probably not very well thought out, and they haven't really come to grips with like the reality of the world, much as I think Trump hasn't, that the world has moved on, and it's not simply going to go back. Things are not going to go back to the way they were. With the Brexit project, there was always, we're talking about the kind of the changes brought by globalization with the Brexit project. There was a heavy dose of nostalgia for the British Empire, and that's another thing that is not coming back. But as well as that, I think there is a growing awareness, and I think this is the bit that will sort of take precedence and is doing in many countries, which is, well, actually, we might not say it openly, but we do know that this is a situation of kind of trying to manage a decline and also manage an increasingly threatening climate globally. I mean, literally, the climate here, is already causing pressures on food prices that are feeding through to Western consumers. Not in as acute ways as this is happening in other parts of the world, but we all know it's happening now. And that response is to kind of throw up the defenses, both literally and metaphorically. I think it's a kind of, well, if we can't be the winners, we're going to wall ourselves off and preserve what we've got and make sure that we can cut people adrift when, things really get dicey in terms of the climate crisis. And I think this comes out in several different ways. One is, I think this is what the focus on immigration is all about. It's about the building of these symbolic defenses. And to say symbolic doesn't mean that they're not actually physical as well and hugely harmful to people. But, what did Trump call it? Alligator Alcatraz. But building that prison in the middle of the swamps in Florida was about what it said as much as what it did. Here in the UK, Reform's promises to deport hundreds of thousands of people, to set up a British ICE. They announced their intention to create a British ICE several weeks after the actual American ICE had shot dead 2 US citizens who were peacefully protesting against them. It's about this kind of symbolic wielding of the threat of violence and sort of doing it in a way that kind of points at the borders and says, we're going to secure this for everybody. At the same time, far-right populists are also committed capitalists. They love markets, they love profit, they love inequality. And within countries, I think they're also thinking, well, how do we kind of regenerate profit making in these new circumstances? And really, there are 3 ways in which you can get hold of workers who are going to, do the work, create the value and the profits for the capitalists. One is you have plentiful immigration, provided there are immigrants who want to come to your country. 2 is that you massively reduce the working conditions and living standards of people already living in the country working there. And 3 is that you get your citizens to have more babies. And the far right, for the far right, immigration is off the table, but they are increasingly noisy about those other 2 ways of achieving it. So Reform's latest policy announcement in early to mid-May was that they were going to allow people who work more than 40 hours a week, they were going to remove taxes from any pay worked overtime over 40 hours a week. That's a Trump policy, but it's also about kind of encouraging people to think of themselves as more easily exploitable, to create this idea that you should basically work till you drop, and that's how you become a winner, and so on. There, I think you can see an element of them thinking, well, actually, one of the things holding Britain back is that we treat our workers too well. And the other one on getting citizens to have more babies, I think is an increasingly dominant theme in the Western far right. It's this idea known as natalism. The Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni has been very big on this. That she wants to promote Italians having more babies. The US Christian far right is big on this. Anti-abortion and anti-LGBT and anti-feminist politics are a big part of this as well. And I think within that, that's the use that set of reactionary ideas serves in the current far right, is that it's part of this emerging politics of, right, we throw up the defences and we reinvigorate the nation by making women pump out babies, by making young people obedient, biddable, enthusiastic workers again. And I think that's kind of, it's not fully articulated yet, but I think that's the bit that's going to win out, because the kind of let's just go back to the neoliberal boom for the West at least is a lost cause.
Do you think Nigel Farage will be the next prime minister, and what do you think a government led by him will actually, I mean, in reality would look like?
I think it's unlikely that he will be the next prime minister straight away, but I think it's possible, and I think it's possible long run either him or his way of doing politics will win out and win power. Reform have got a huge advantage at the moment with Britain's first past the post electoral system, which means that you can win seats on a minority of votes in a constituency and on a minority of the popular vote. So Labour won this huge majority 2 years ago. They did it with 33% of the popular vote. And Reform are very aware that they need to get to around that level of support to have any chance of winning a governing majority in Parliament. I think that will be very difficult for them. Their support seems to be peaking at around 25% for the moment, and that's because they've reached a stage of their growth where they're at an impasse, where they've kind of maxed out voters who are fully into their kind of core far-right populist mood music, you know, the resentment, the wanting to punish the other, all of these things that I was talking about. What they now need to do is win the support of people who are a bit wary of that, but might be convinced on other grounds. For instance, we've got a plan to revive Britain's economy. Labour had their go, the Conservatives had their go, they failed, so you might as well give us a try. But the more that they try and appeal to those voters, the more they risk alienating parts of their core support who will say you've gone soft and split off or just cause internal disruption. And both those things have actually been happening. So there's a by-election campaign underway at the moment in the northwest of England, where it's Andy Burnham, who is a former Labour MP, who's trying to get elected so he can become the next Prime Minister and save the fortunes of the Labour Party, up against Reform. And it's not clear who will win, but the worrying development for Reform is that a new far-right populist party, Restore Britain, which was formed by a disgruntled former Reform MP, has started to pick up support in the constituency as well. And what it's saying is Reform have gone soft. You know, they're too mainstream now. You need to vote for us. We're the authentic far-right populists. So these things get in the way of a smooth path to power for Farage. What I think is more likely, however, is that, you know, come the next election, his party will win a lot of seats. And depending on the overall electoral maths, the next government may well be some kind of coalition or informal agreement between what's left of the Conservative Party and Reform. So I think we've got a very strong chance of seeing a government that goes even more down the line of far-right populism than, say, Boris Johnson's Tories did. You're in answer to your question about what a government like that might do, whether it's Farage as Prime Minister or just a government that is more like Reform than it's like anything else, they've got a plan. One of their MPs even described it as Trump 2.0, not Trump 1.0. So in a way that Donald Trump, when he was re-elected president, kind of began his term with this sort of shock and awe politics. You know, he's going to come in, fire people, pass executive orders, stamp his authority on those, you know, those institutions of liberal democracy that we were talking about earlier on. Reform want to do a similar thing. You know, their analysis of why it's so hard to govern in Britain and bring about meaningful change is that the British civil service has become dominated by a class of woke, ineffectual, time-serving civil servants, and that they need to be shaken up or even sacked to get their way. Others have had a similar analysis. That was Boris Johnson's analysis to some extent. What they found was, the civil servants are there to do what you tell them. So maybe the bigger problem is if you arrive in government without having a very coherent set of ideas about what you want to do with the country. B, if you fire them or threaten to fire them, they get very unhappy, and then your governing gets much less efficient. So I think there would be a lot of chaos, but I think Reform have already signalled their intention to exceed the boundaries of acceptability in terms of, you know, the Boris Johnson government kind of threatened things. It threatened to deal with woke lefty activist lawyers and judges it didn't like, but it did some pretty objectionable things, but it could have gone a lot further. I think Reform intend, if they ever get the chance, to go a lot further, to do versions of what we've seen in the US or in Hungary or in Poland, to start actually kind of changing the nature of the institutions that we rely on to protect us and protect our liberties.
Why do you think the Labour Party has been, I mean, especially in the last, I mean, their behavior confuses me on a bunch of things since I've actually got to Britain on Gaza, on the response to this. And obviously they weren't in power for a long period of time. But since returning to power, why do you think they've been, outside of, the fact that Keir Starmer is Keir Starmer, but that's obviously part of the answer, so sort of, incompetent in terms of dealing with this threat from reform and the Tories becoming like reform and some people in reform going to restore?
I think institutionally they've cut themselves off at the knees in several stages. So I suppose the Faustian pact that Tony Blair made with reconstituting Labour as New Labour was that they abandoned their commitment to not only maintaining social democracy in the way we knew it from the 20th century, but to Labour as a project for increasing democratic control over common resources. That the point of the Labour Party was to increase ordinary people's power over their working conditions, over how resources were spent, over the economy, the market, and so on. And there's almost a kind of, for years, this kind of neurosis reigned within Labour that, like, you mustn't even acknowledge that had happened, and you certainly mustn't acknowledge that it was perhaps a mistake and that there were alternatives. So that idea has really kind of dominated the mentality of the people in charge of the Labour Party. Labour Party members don't necessarily agree, and that's why they elected Jeremy Corbyn as leader in 2015, because they were just so frustrated with this dominant idea that you couldn't ever change anything and there was no left-wing alternatives to the neoliberal way of doing things. At that point it was that Labour were not opposing austerity with any kind of vigour. And then you had the second way in which they cut themselves off at the knees, in that the Corbyn years, they were full of sectarian dispute and so on, which we don't have time to get into. But what that resulted in was the Corbyn faction were defeated, and the people who took charge of the Labour Party under Keir Starmer, the people around him, the people in charge of the Labour Party machine, made it their mission to make sure that the left, and their definition of left is very, very broad, had absolutely no say in the running of the party or even a voice. That they were stigmatized, cast out, and that the earth was salted so that left-wing politics could never again grow within the Labour Party. And then on top of that, I think on a personnel level, because it was those people who had kind of won the battle and ended up occupying all the positions of power within the Labour Party's hierarchy, in terms of who were advising government and who had the ear of the Prime Minister and so on, they were also completely unsuited to governing. Their kind of their sort of moral and political yardstick is, have we sufficiently bashed the left today, and do the right-wing papers applaud us for doing it? And I think they were a bit taken aback on entering government to find that really something quite more substantial was required. They're allergic to even the suggestion that they would have an ideology. The way in which ideology as a term is talked about in British politics is, I was born here and grew up here, and I find it really odd. It must look very odd to people from other parts of the world. Like, to have an ideology in politics is regarded as a serious disability. And Keir Starmer exemplifies that. He makes a virtue of the fact he has, so he says, no ideology. When he was leader of the opposition, he told his staff, reportedly, there is no such thing as Starmerism and there never will be. I will make one decision after another. And obviously the absence of ideology is a heavily ideological position. And what that means is you just go with whatever the reigning dynamic
if you look at results, it's failing.
Yeah, and
yes.
In 2024, the reigning dynamic was collapsing British governing institutions, and Labour have essentially, in many ways, just gone along with that. And I think also politically we're really naive in thinking that just because, the Starmer leadership were applauded by the right-wing press for having defeated Corbyn and Corbynism, that meant that the right-wing press liked them per se and would give them an easy ride when they got into power. And at the first moment of weakness, what did the right-wing press do? Well, it went for the jugular, whether it was over things like the donors scandal in the first few months of government, or just really hammering them over the immigration statistics and causing this panic in the Labour government over immigration, the rise of reform and so on, because that's what actually suits the right politically, because it's seeing their weakening Labour and seeing what they want advanced. And I think Labour had its... Personally, I think it's one thing to make mistakes, but I think it's absolutely unforgivable to arrive with it without even a plan, seemingly, for how you're going to negotiate the very obvious challenges that face you.
Do you see a component of the Labour Party that is left, the part that has been defeated, forming some sort of allyship, if not an alliance, or partnership or weird electoral strategy with people like, the Zach Belansky and the Green Party, people who are outright sort of, fighting against, many elements, not just reform, establishment politics also, but basically fighting this fear of what we're calling the far right?
I don't think there's much chance of a formal alliance, because the Labour has a lot to lose from that, and it's a very conservative institution. It's dominated the left in Britain in a way that in other countries you don't see. In a lot of other countries you might have a leading centre-left party, but then several others that have some kind of influence around it. In Britain, it's been the Labour Party or nothing for a century, and Labour is allergic to working with groups outside of its own institution. I think where the change is more likely to come is that people, more or less across the board, looking at how British politics is fragmented into... We're now in a situation where we have 5 or 6 party politics, depending on which bit of the country you're in, and a national electoral system that it just... whatever its strengths and weaknesses in the past, it just manifestly does not produce results that reflect voting patterns. Reform was the big winner in those local elections in England recently, but it got 26% of the vote, and yet was winning a much more outsized number of seats than that proportion would suggest. So I think what's more likely to happen, or at least what I think should happen, is that there needs to be some serious reform of the electoral system, an acknowledgement that in the near to medium future we are in this situation of multi-party politics. We should have a system that produces results that reflect that, and then it's for the parties of the left or socially liberal or progressive parties to work out how they cooperate. But that's going to take such a huge kind of shift in mentality of a lot of people who work in the kind of professional political class, because it's just a situation that Britain has not encountered before.
Yeah, no, I do see that being an uphill battle. Your comments on that, but just also, we need to start moving on and sort of wrapping this up. Sort of, what can ordinary people who just want to live in a society which is more kind, which is more multicultural or open to multiculturalism, which wants to ensure, whether you're slightly left or slightly right, but sort of want to ensure that citizens can be looked after and without having to be nasty to other people, what can they do?
Yeah, well, I think on the kind of the formal political level, this is a dangerous time we live in, but the opportunity there is it has actually opened up real political debate and a sense that we are finally acknowledging as a society that the established ways of doing things politically, particularly neoliberal governance, is not working. Even within the Labour Party, debates over future leadership of the Labour Party are also debates about, well, how do we break with some of the received wisdom of neoliberalism and so on. Then you've got the Green Party outside trying to mount a more substantial challenge from the left. So one thing that we can do is actually engage politically and like get our heads around these different debates, have our say, pressure our politicians to do the things we want, you know, whether that's in local government, national government, and so on. But you're absolutely right to say there's a kind of more fundamental thing here, which is, as I see it, you can describe the rise of far-right populism and its current domination of mainstream political discourse as a large, noisy minority of people shouting everyone else down, intimidating them, bullying them into silence and into going along with what they want. And that's a very real threat, but they are in the minority. And what it requires is for people to speak up and challenge that. And I think when you do see people speaking up and challenging it, it makes a huge, huge difference. So whether that's having political activists come forward and just the fact of somebody being on like the weekly round of BBC politics shows and so on, explicitly challenging reform on the grounds that what they want is racist, divisive, and will harm people in the UK, makes a big difference. Unfortunately, we do now have a few politicians doing that. But I think just as importantly, in fact, more importantly, I think, it's finding ways in which we can do that from where we are, where we live. You know, something that has dominated the way Britain is talked about, particularly England, because Scotland and Wales have also got devolved politics and a slightly healthier political culture. But England is talked about as if the division between the London-based elite and the rest of the country also means that all of the rest of us who live in the country are kind of divided along those lines as well. That, you know, everybody who lives in a northern former industrial town that voted for Brexit is a reform supporter, and everyone who lives in a inner London borough is a Zach Polanski loving Green Party voter, you know, with completely different ideas to their counterparts in the north of England. It's not true. There are, you know, there are many, many people who oppose what reform stand for, what the wider right stands for, living outside London in those other bits of the country, just as there are many, many people who live in the big cities who oppose it. And I think it's really important, obviously, to sort of challenge things where we live, but find ways that we can kind of connect with each other and sort of support our neighbours' struggles in other places and kind of strengthen one another as we do this.
Daniel Trilling, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks very much.